Okay, ready to dive into something pretty wild today.
Absolutely. Should be a fascinating one.
Today we're looking at head transplantation. Sometimes you hear it called full body transplantation. But either way, you're talking about taking the head of one organism and putting it surgically onto the body of another.
Yeah, and right away, I mean, that brings up a lot of questions. Obviously, medical questions, but also I think bigger questions, like what makes you you?
Definitely.
So what we want to do today is, for everyone listening, is kind of explore the history of this idea
Mm.
and look at, well, the
A
challenges.
huge challenge.
Yeah, like how do you actually do this? And then, of course, all the ethical
All the
considerations.
big ethical considerations.
And it's worth saying right up front,
Yeah.
as of right now, March 2025, this has never been done successfully. Long term, I mean.
Yeah, no one's walking around right now with a,
Right.
transplanted head. So let's dig into why that is. On the medical side, what are we even talking about here?
So if you just look at it from like a purely technical point of view,
Yeah.
there's three main problems.
Okay.
One is the immune response,
Uh-huh.
like with any transplant.
Right, the body rejects it.
Yeah, the body's like, what is this? Get it out of here.
Yeah,
The second is you've got to have a continuous blood supply to the brain, obviously.
that makes sense.
You can't, even for a few seconds, cut that off.
Right.
And then the third one, and this is the biggest hurdle by far, is how do you connect the nervous systems?
Oh, yeah. How do you even begin to do that?
Right. It's one thing to connect blood vessels. It's another to
It's a whole other thing.
take all the nerves from the brain, down the spinal cord, out to the entire body.
You're talking like millions of connections.
Yeah,
No.
a massive, massive number.
Yeah.
And this isn't like plugging in a cable.
Right.
This is like microscopic surgery times a million.
So on the first 2 points, the immune system, the blood supply,
Uh,
we've gotten pretty good at those things for like other organ transplants, right? Like kidneys, livers.
we have.
So is any of that helpful here?
It is, yeah. So, over the years, surgeons have gotten really good at connecting blood vessels, and we have drugs that can suppress the immune system.
Immunosuppressants.
Right. So that means that, like, kidney transplants, liver transplants, even heart transplants,
Huh.
those are pretty routine now.
Yeah.
But even with those, right,
Yeah.
people can still reject the organ, especially in that first year.
Right.
And, not everyone survives forever with a new organ.
Sure.
So you take all that and you apply it to something as complicated as a whole head,
Yeah.
and it's a whole new ball game.
You're talking about orders of magnitude more complex.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then you add in the nervous system piece, which we haven't even solved for simpler things.
Right.
And it's mind-boggling.
So let's take a step back then and look at where did this all begin? Where do the first attempts at head transplantation even come from?
So the earliest we know about, I guess, is
Uh-huh.
way back in 1908.
Wow, okay.
Yeah, so there was this French surgeon, Alexis Carrel, super important guy. He helped develop the techniques for connecting blood vessels
Uh-huh.
that we still use in organ transplants. He won a Nobel Prize for that later on. But anyway, back in 1908, he was working with an American surgeon named Charles Claude Guthrie,
Okay.
and they tried to basically take a dog's head and attach it to another dog.
Okay, so this is a two-headed dog situation.
Kinda, yeah. The second dog still had its own head.
Oh, wow.
But the transplanted head, it moved a little bit, like reflexively,
Yeah.
but then pretty quickly it died. The whole thing only lasted a few hours.
Oh, wow. So they didn't even really get the blood flowing right.
Well, enough for some basic function, it seems.
Yeah.
But not for long.
That's so wild.
Yeah. And it's kind of a weird bit of history that Carroll won the Nobel Prize, but Guthrie didn't.
Oh, interesting.
Even though they were both working on this together, some people think maybe it was because of this head transplant stuff that it was just too controversial at the time.
Yeah. So they were just focused on the surgical part, right? Like, how do you physically connect the head?
It seems like it, yeah.
Okay.
But then in the 1950s, a Soviet surgeon, Vladimir Demikov,
Yeah.
he really pushed things forward.
Okay.
This guy, he was already known for his work on coronary bypass surgery,
Okay.
so like heart surgery stuff.
Uh-huh.
But in 1954, he did these crazy experiments.
What did he do?
He grafted the head and upper body of a puppy,
What?
yeah, puppy, onto a larger adult dog. So we're talking front legs, everything.
Oh, wow. So like 2 heads and 4 front legs.
Yeah, basically.
Yeah.
And his goal was, again, mainly about the blood supply.
Okay. So how to keep both parts alive.
Exactly.
And what happened?
Well, most of them only lived a few days. But one dog, it lived for almost a month. 29 days.
Wow.
And during that time, the grafted head and the upper body, It was moving. It was reacting.
That's incredible.
It is. But ultimately, they all died from transplant rejection.
So even with the blood flowing, the body was still like, nope, not having it.
Exactly. And it's a reminder that you can solve the blood vessel problem,
Mm-hmm.
but if you don't solve the immune system problem,
Yeah.
it's not going to work.
It's not going to work long term.
Right.
So two-headed dogs in the 1950s. That's wild to think about.
Yeah. And it was happening at the same time that all these other big advances in transplant medicine were happening.
Okay.
So, in the 50s and 60s, they were figuring out immunosuppressant drugs.
Right.
And they were getting better at the actual surgical techniques.
Uh-huh.
So that's why, we can do kidney transplants now, liver transplants. So it became like standard procedures.
Right.
So you had this progress happening in transplant medicine generally.
Uh-huh.
And I think that gave some people the idea that maybe, just maybe, head transplants could be possible too, even though it was still super experimental.
Super experimental.
Right.
So who picked up this research after, the two-headed dogs?
So in the 60s and 70s, there was an American neurosurgeon, Robert J. White.
Okay.
And he did a whole bunch of experiments. He started out focusing on just the blood flow to the brain.
Okay.
So he would take a dog brain, like isolate it,
Uh-huh.
and then he would connect the blood vessels of the brain to another dog's body.
Okay.
But he wasn't trying to connect the whole head,
Just the brain.
just the brain.
Wow.
And he was able to show that with the right blood flow, a brain could stay functional,
Okay.
at least for a while. Like some of them lasted 6 hours, some even 2 days.
Oh, that's pretty remarkable. So he was really isolating one specific part of the problem.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then in 1970, he took it a step further. He did actual head transplants on monkeys.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So he would take the head off one monkey
Uh-huh.
and he would attach the blood vessels to the body of another monkey. But he didn't try to connect the nerves.
Okay.
And to protect the brain during surgery, he used deep hypothermia.
To basically like cool it down.
Yeah, slow everything down.
Okay.
And the recipient monkeys, they were on a ventilator.
To breathe for them.
Right.
Okay.
And he used drugs to keep their hearts going.
So it's like their body was essentially being kept alive artificially.
Basically, yeah.
And what about the monkey head? What was going on there?
So the heads, they actually showed some signs of activity.
Okay.
Their eyes could track movement, and they were able to, like, chew and swallow.
Really?
Yeah. But there were a lot of problems. Blood clots,
Yeah.
and he had to give them tons of immunosuppressants.
Oh, right. To prevent rejection.
Yeah.
And those have a lot of side effects.
Tons of side effects.
Yeah.
And so even with all that, the monkeys only lived for a few hours, maybe a few days.
So it's like he proved it was possible to kind of keep the head alive, but all of these other problems just overwhelmed the whole thing.
Right. It was a proof of concept.
Yeah.
But it also highlighted just how hard this is.
So I imagine this caused a lot of controversy. Public outcry, all that.
Huge outcry.
Yeah.
I mean, the media was all over it. People were calling him Dr. Butcher,
Oh, gosh.
comparing him to Frankenstein.
Yeah, I could see that.
Animal rights groups, PETA, they were furious.
Rightfully so, probably.
Yeah, they called it cruel vivisection. So after that, for a while, there wasn't as much research on head transplants.
People kind of backed off a bit.
Yeah, I think partly because of the ethical backlash,
Right.
and the public just wasn't ready for it.
But I'm guessing the scientific questions didn't go away, did they?
No, not at all.
People were still thinking about this.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so what happened next?
So in 2012, this Chinese researcher, Xiaoping Ren, he published a paper on head transplants in mice.
Okay.
And like some of the earlier work, he was mainly focused on the surgical technique,
Okay.
like how to minimize blood loss during the transplant.
Uh-huh.
And he was able to get the mouse heads to survive for up to 6 months.
Wow. 6 months.
Yeah.
That's a pretty long time for a mouse.
It is. And it was a big step forward in terms of just, keeping the head alive.
Right.
So things are progressing, at least on that front.
Okay, so what happened after that?
Well, that brings us to Sergio Canavero.
Okay, this is a name I've heard before.
Okay, he's a bit of a controversial figure.
Okay.
So in 2013, he comes out and says, we can do human head transplants.
Whoa.
Yeah,
Just like that.
pretty much, yeah. He laid out a whole protocol for how to do it.
Okay.
And then in 2016, he says he's going to operate on this guy, Valery Spiridonov.
And he was what, a volunteer?
Yeah, Spiridonov had this really severe spinal muscular atrophy,
Okay.
and he was basically willing to try anything.
So he volunteered for this.
He did.
Wow.
And Canavero, he even said there was a 90% chance of success.
90%? I mean, come on.
Yeah, a lot of people were like, really? 90%?
This has never been done before in a human.
Right.
And he's saying 90%.
Yeah, so there was a lot of skepticism.
Rightfully so.
Yeah, and in the end, Spiridonov backed out.
Oh, okay.
He said it was for personal reasons, but in the meantime, that other researcher, Xiaoping Ren,
The one with the mice?
yeah,
Okay.
he was still working on things. And in 2015, he published a paper on a slightly different approach.
Okay.
So instead of completely cutting off the recipient's head, he left the brainstem in place.
The brain stem.
Yeah, it's the part of the brain that controls, like, your basic life functions.
Breathing, heartbeat, that kind of stuff.
Exactly. And then he connected the donor head's blood vessels to the recipient's body.
Oh, okay.
So the idea was to see if the recipient's body could keep itself alive, basically.
Without needing, like, life support for the new head.
Right.
So it was, like, a less extreme kind of head transplant.
Yeah, less radical.
Yeah.
And then in 2016, Ren and Canavero, they actually wrote a paper together.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, a review article. They talked about all these different strategies for protecting the brain during the transplant, like how to connect the blood vessels really well, different levels of hypothermia.
Right, to cool the brain down.
Yeah, and even using blood substitutes. And this other thing, hydrogen sulfide,
Okay.
which they think might help protect the brain cells.
Wait.
So they were really trying to address all the things that could go wrong.
Right, all those things we talked about earlier.
Exactly.
So it sounds like there's still a ton of work to do,
Oh, yeah.
but people haven't given up.
Not at all.
Okay, so let's talk about the ethical side of this, because that's a whole other can of worms, right?
Definitely.
I mean, this is not just a scientific puzzle.
It's not.
There are some really big ethical questions here.
It's huge ethical questions.
And it's not like this is the first time transplants have been controversial, right?
Right.
I mean, think about the first kidney transplants, heart transplants.
Yeah.
People were freaked out about those too.
They were.
But we kind of worked through it, right?
We did.
We had the ethical discussions, we figured out the guidelines, and now those are accepted procedures.
Right.
So what's different about head transplants?
Well, for one thing, with those other transplants, we had time to, have the ethical debates.
Before we started doing them on people.
Right.
Okay.
But with head transplants, it's like the science is running ahead of the ethics.
So we're kind of trying to figure this out on the fly.
Yeah. And it's not like there's one big ethical problem with head transplants.
Okay.
It's more like a whole bunch of problems all tangled together.
Give me some examples.
So, like, informed consent.
Oh, yeah. How can someone truly consent to something this experimental?
Right.
And what about the body donor?
Exactly. They don't get a say in this.
Yeah.
And then there's the issue of resources.
Okay.
Like, one donor body could save multiple lives through organ donation.
Right.
But with a head transplant, you're using the whole body for one person.
So it's a different kind of calculation?
It is. And then there's the legal stuff.
Oh, yeah.
Like, who is this person, legally speaking?
The person with the new head, the person with the old body.
It's not clear.
Yeah.
And what about their rights?
Right. It's a whole new category of person.
Exactly.
Oh.
And then there's the quality of life issue.
Okay.
Like we said, we can't reconnect the spinal cord yet.
Right.
So even if the transplant works, the person is probably going to be paralyzed.
Oh, wow.
And that raises some serious ethical questions.
Yeah.
Like, is it ethical to do this to someone, even if they consent?
Right. Even if it's what they want.
Exactly. And what about the cost?
Of their care.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Long-term care for someone who's paralyzed is expensive.
So who pays for that?
Right.
And then, I mean, what about the psychological impact?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, we've seen some psychological issues with face transplant recipients, but this is on a whole other level, right?
Totally. I mean, with a face transplant, you still have your own body.
Right.
But with a head transplant, you wake up in a completely different body.
That must be so disorienting.
Yeah, and we have no idea what the long-term effects would be.
And some people think it could be really bad.
Oh, yeah.
Like, there was this letter published in a medical journal back in 2015, and they basically said that head transplant recipients could go insane.
Yeah, they use that word insanity.
Wow.
They were basically saying that the brain might not be able to handle being in a completely foreign body.
Like, the mismatch would be too much.
Right.
So it sounds like there's a lot of concern ethically. And what about the public? What did they think of Canavero's plans?
Most people were pretty negative about it.
Okay.
They thought the technology wasn't there yet.
Right.
And they thought Canavero's timeline was way too optimistic.
Yeah, I mean, 90% success rate, come on.
Right.
So there was a lot of pushback.
There was.
Which, makes sense.
Yeah.
This is a pretty radical idea.
It is. But what's interesting is that head transplants have been a part of popular culture for a long time.
Really? Like in books and movies?
Books, movies, TV shows, even video games.
Wow. Okay. Like what?
Well, there's this Russian science fiction novel from 1925, Professor Dowell's Head,
Okay.
and it's about, well, a professor who does head transplants.
Sounds about right.
Yeah. And then in comics, you've got Gorilla Man.
Gorilla Man.
Yeah, he's a Marvel character.
Yeah.
He had his head transplanted onto a gorilla's body.
Oh, wow.
And in anime, there's JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, where the bad guy, Dio, puts his head on the hero's body.
Okay. Getting a little creepy now.
Yeah.
What else?
Well, there's a more recent novel, Imagin,
Mm.
from 2014.
Okay.
It's about a teenager who gets a head transplant.
Okay.
And then there's a kids' book series, Dog Man, which started in 2016.
I've heard of that one.
Yeah, it's about a cop who has a dog's head.
Okay, so it's not always super serious?
No, not always.
And what about movies and TV?
Oh, tons of examples there.
Okay.
There's a classic horror movie from 1962 called The Brain That Wouldn't Die. And then some more over-the-top ones, like The Incredible Two-Headed Transplant and The Thing with Two Heads.
Two heads seems to be a popular theme.
It does.
Okay, what else?
And then, The Outer Limits, The X-Files, they both had episodes about head transplants or brain transplants.
Right.
And then just last year, there's this video that went viral.
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
It looked super real,
It did.
but it was fake. It was just animation.
Yeah,
But it shows that people are still fascinated by this idea.
definitely. And what about video games?
Oh, yeah. There's Wolfenstein II, The New Colossus.
Okay.
The main character gets a head transplant in that one.
So it's everywhere.
It is.
It's like this idea, it just keeps popping up.
Yeah, and I think it's because it makes us think about some really deep stuff.
Like what?
Like, what is identity?
Okay.
What makes you, you? Is it your body? Is it your brain?
Mm-hmm.
And what happens if you separate those two things?
Right. It's like it challenges our whole idea of what it means to be human.
Exactly.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into head transplants, what are the big takeaways?
Well, first of all, it's really, really hard to do.
Yeah.
I mean, medically speaking,
Uh-huh.
there's the immune rejection, the blood supply, and then the nervous system, which is just
The biggest hurdle.
the biggest hurdle by far. And then second, we've been trying to do this for over 100 years,
Uh-huh.
and we've had some small successes.
Right, like the mice living for 6 months.
Right.
But nothing permanent.
No. And then finally, there are all these ethical questions that we haven't really answered yet.
Informed consent, resource allocation, the definition of self.
All of that.
It's a lot to think about.
It is.
And it's kind of amazing, right, that we have this idea, this dream of head transplants.
Yeah.
But the reality is so far behind.
Way behind.
And it makes you wonder, for everyone listening,
Uh-huh.
where is the line between scientific progress and, just doing too much?
Right.
It's a question we'll probably be wrestling with for a long time.
Absolutely.
So thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
And until next time, keep thinking, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.